Hello, I'm George Labovitz. As a consultant, a researcher, a professor, I spent a lot of my time working in a lot of different organizations. And in those organizations, I spent a lot of my time talking to managers. The common pervasive theme or complaint that I keep hearing is the fact that a lot of supervisors and managers today are concerned about the fact they aren't able to get the kind of quality and productivity and output out of their folks that they used to. Could it be that part of that problem may be caused by us? Perhaps we've met the enemy and it's us. Are we trying to apply old principles, old ways of dealing with people to a whole new set of conditions and problems? Where did you learn to manage anyway? I wonder, for example, how many of you were spawned out of some technical trade, like engineering? In the old days, my era, engineering meant slide rule pushing. 4 years to learn how to run a slide rule. I never figured that out. It was too technical for me. But I bet a lot of you did. And after 4 years of school, some company bought your body because they needed people to push slide rules, for example. Perhaps you got a graduate degree in slide rules. Perhaps you got to be the best pusher of slide rules in the whole organization. And all of your time was spent doing this technical thing called slide rule pushing. If you're the best salesman, the best engineer, the best of anything, what inevitably seems to happen to us? We're promoted. And what's the first thing they do when they promote us? They take away our slide rules. It was the only thing that we were good at. Now, only part of your time is spent pushing a slide rule, for example. The other part is spent managing, whatever that is. Now, only part of your time is back there at the lab, and the other part is spent dealing with people. Now you have a whole new set of problems you didn't have before when you were down here. You have people who tell you where to go. The slide rule never told you where to go. You have people who don't show up to tell you where to go. And then if you survive at this level, probably the hardest job in any organization, someday you'll be rewarded. The boss comes by, puts his arm around you and says, Martha, or Sam, or Bob, your vacation schedules were the only ones I could read. That has nothing to do with slide rules. I'm making you, he says, VP of engineering, guaranteeing that you will become the least competent engineer in the whole place. Now, it's okay to manage people who are smarter than we are, people who are more current than we are. You're a long way from the bench. Now you're a manager. You've got a whole new set of conditions, a whole new set of problems, and you need a whole new set of skills. You're worried about long-range planning and organizational integration and keeping the place together and accomplishing objectives. They're worried about slide rules. Right now, as we speak, some kid fresh out of engineering school is going up to her boss, and she's saying, hey, Sam, did you read this month's Journal of Hydraulic Engineering? And there's this new theory about the flow of viscous fluids in cylindrical shaped forms. Does Sam tell the kid that he didn't understand a word the kid just said? Does Sam tell the kid that his subscription expired 6 years ago to that journal? And then, God forbid, the VP of engineering, who never heard of the journal, gets sucked up into this. No, it seems to me that we have to accept the fact that we manage, they push slide rules, and together we accomplish organizational objectives. Why is it so difficult for managers today to accept the fact that it's okay to manage people who are smarter, more current than we are? It goes back a long way. We are products, perhaps, of the world's, or one of the world's, oldest professions. We've been doing this thing called management from the beginning of time. You know, when you think about it, you can't have civilization. You can't burn, you can't loot, you can't grow, you can't conquer until one human being does what another human being tells him to do. Perhaps the finest management training film ever made that describes the roots of management better than anything I could think of is the movie The 10 Commandments. I wonder how many of you saw that movie. You may remember that very impressive scene where they open up the wide screen, Cecil B. DeMille, and they show you thousands of slaves being whipped out in the hot sun. And they're lugging these huge blocks of granite, 200 slaves on a rope. And in one particular scene, one of the slaves falls underneath the block and gets squished. That scene brings tears to the eyes of any manager who sees it. It's beautiful. No union, high productivity, no turnover, little attrition, but you can handle that. And it's all run, all managed, all coordinated by one chief executive officer. Who is this person that gets it all together and never leaves his tent? Vincent Price. Imagine that you're Vincent Price. You're chief of the pyramid building shop, and you get a telex from the Pharaoh. A slave comes in with a tablet and falls at your feet. You look down at the tablet or the telex and it says, "To Vincent from the Pharaoh." Subject: build me one 6014-20 pyramid no later than. What are you going to do? You probably do what Vincent did in the movie. You'd say to yourself, 6014-20, that's the big model. That's a 30,000 slave model. You're going to have to get yourself a director of slaves, an expert who knows how to beat them and whip them and train them, because you don't know how to do that. You're just a pyramid builder. And then you probably ask yourself, well, where am I going to get 30,000 slaves? Mesopotamia. You'll go to Mesopotamia, you'll bring it back here. Except you don't know how to do that. You have to get a general who's an expert who knows how to do that. And then finally, do you know how many rocks there are in a pyramid? That's materials management. You need experts in logistics who know how to cut them and ship them and stack them. You filled 4 slots. You get 29,996 slots to fill. The first thing managers have done for centuries, whenever they have a task to accomplish, is to break the task up into pieces. But at the top of classical old-time organizations, the pieces are very big. Big, fat, functional pieces. These people don't change hats very easily. They're all specialists. That's why Vincent can't have a very wide span of control. They're all smarter than he is. Then a process begins. In management, it's called the scalar process. A process, kind of like throwing out a bedspread. An organization falls out from the top, and it gets wider as it goes down. And the reason that it gets wider is that the tasks are getting simpler. When tasks get simpler, you can manage more people. So spans of control get wider at every level. The director of slaves is only managing people who are in the slave business. They all went to the same schools. They studied the same subjects. They know how to make whips. But you're running 3 shifts on the pyramid, so there are probably more levels. And finally, eventually, you hit the bottom. The very bottom of the organization often has, in a classical organization, the widest spans of control of all. Way down here in the bottom, one first-line head beater of slaves is beating up 25 slaves. And the only reason he or she doesn't beat up 26 is her whip only goes to 25. But there's another first-line supervisor with a whip beating up 25 or so slaves. I remind you, in your organization and in mine, that it's way down here at the bottom where the rubber meets the road, where the organization meets its customers. But in a classical organization, Vincent wasn't really concerned about that. He just had to organize this way, and what he was really trying to do when he organized this way was to answer the timeless question of management. The timeless question is, how can we get people to do work that we don't want to do either? And the way you do it is to organize this way and control behavior down here. This hangs down like a child's mobile. You can hit one part of it, but the rest of it doesn't change very much. And it works. Lastly, if you saw the movie, you may remember Edward G. Robinson. He didn't have anything to do with the pyramid. In fact, all he really did was hang around the tent with Vincent. He dressed like Vincent, and when Vincent wasn't looking, he drank wine from Vincent's goblet. Staff. All organizations have people like this. Their job is to take care of Vincent. Vincent's job is to build the pyramid. Now, no one ever said line versus staff. All they said was you got to have people who do that, and you got to have people who do that. This used to work, but it won't work for you and it won't work for me. Because Vincent operated in a world where he didn't have competition. He didn't have people across town building these things cheaper. And he had 75 years or so to get it done. That's not the world that you and I work in. And his principles, his conditions, his ways of doing it aren't going to work for us. What was he really doing? He had actually a simple task. It was big, but it was simple. It's almost as if he had an army with 30,000 people who threw spears. That's big and fat, but it's simple. I wonder how many of you out there, for example, have ever painted by the numbers. Those of us who have one thing in common. We have no talent. Some genius produced this blank canvas with faint little lines and told us to paint 1s red and 2s blue and 3s yellow. That's what Vincent did. That's what managers have been doing for centuries. What Vincent really did was to organize work this way and to say to 10,000 slaves, you 10,000 slaves paint 1s red, you paint 2s blue, you paint 3s yellow. For that, you don't need graduate training in management. And then if he really wanted to be sophisticated, he could say, I want you to be the best painters of 1 I've ever had. That's called sub-optimization. If all the little parts are the best, the whole thing must be the best. And lastly, he probably would say, I want you to be the best painters of 2 I've ever had, or I will kill you. That's called motivation. Vincent brought a set of assumptions to work, a set of assumptions about the nature of people that were in his organization. His assumptions were that those people didn't want to be there. They weren't motivated, they weren't educated, they weren't rational, they were lazy, they were slothful, and you know what? His assumptions were probably pretty accurate. So perhaps one of the lessons is, if you have that kind of employee, perhaps you should consider organizing the way Vincent did. But I suggest most of the people who work for us are not like that. They have the potential to bring great creative energy to the workplace if we, management, let them. It's a lot tougher today to do that. The golden age of management is really over. I think the golden age of management might have been the Depression in the United States. I think about that because my mother worked for $9 a week in a shoe factory during the Depression. $9 a week, 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. And sometimes twice a month on Sunday, she was asked to come into the factory and clean it at no pay. And if she didn't want to come in and clean it at no pay, she could get out of line. There was a long line of men and women waiting for my mother's crummy $9 a week. What a piece of cake it would be to manage my mother in the Depression. Actually, that's not true if you knew my mother. However, in the 20s and the 30s, management began to understand that there were complexities going on in the workforce that we couldn't really comprehend because we didn't have any theory. We didn't have any understanding of human nature and how people tick. One of the most interesting studies started off in 1927. It was called the Hawthorne Studies. It was the first study of its type that tried to figure out what motivates people at work. Now remember, this was 1927. They were dealing with non-human elements of motivation. If they increased lighting, if they gave them an extra coffee break, if they let them out early, would people work harder? In a very famous segment of that study, they wanted to see if women on a production line would respond to changes in light. So what they did was they took 5 women off a production line of some 500 women, brought them into a special room, and set up a mock production line. After a very short time, the level of production of the experimental group was about the same level as the big group in the main plant. Now they could manipulate variables. And the first variable they tried to manipulate was lighting. They brought in more lights and they asked the 5 women, what do you think now? And the women said, great. And production went up. In fact, it stayed up for a week. After 1 week, they brought in more lights, asked the women, what do you think now? And the women said, terrific, and production went up. And stayed up again for a week. These women were now working like bandits. The researchers were very excited. Management was certainly interested. They had discovered the secret of human motivation at work. All of these years, it must have been light. Finally, one of the researchers came in after another week and shut off all the lights. It was now dark in there. And they asked the women, what do you think now, ladies? And the women said, great. And production went up. 3 weeks. And all they learned in 3 weeks was that lighting, obviously, had nothing to do with productivity. But no one could explain the behavior of the women at the time. We didn't have almost 50 years of research to help explain that behavior. What we now know is that those women were responding to an environment that management had inadvertently created. See, they liked being special. They liked being part of a group. They didn't want to be just one of 500 people on a production line. They'd do almost anything that management asked just to stay together. This idea of environment is critical to understanding the new role of management, because we must understand that the behavior of people, the behavior of those women, the behavior of our employees, and our behavior is caused. It doesn't just happen. Behavior is a function of the individual and the environment. As managers, we often have very little control over the individual and how that individual was raised and got to the point that he or she is today, working for us. What we do control is the environment within which people work. We bring ideas and assumptions to work. They cause us to manage in a certain way. Very often, that style of management causes the very behavior that we complain about. A self-fulfilling prophecy gets started where our assumptions drive negative behavior. We have to detach from our old assumptions. We have to detach from old ideas about the role of people at work and about the role of management at work. What we really do here, our job, I would argue, is to identify and remove obstacles to quality and productivity, not to be one. What we're going to do now is to spend some time giving you the chance to take a look at your assumptions and where you learned this thing called management.